Hello, this is the last video in this short series on PL semantics, though we'll definitely revisit semantic topics in future lessons. In this video, we'll focus on validity for PL arguments, or to be precise, on their invalidity. Remember that an argument is valid if and only if, whenever the premises are true, the conclusion is true as well. In our previous two videos, we mentioned that whenever we talk about truth in PL, we're always talking about truth in an interpretation. For that reason, an argument in PL is valid if and only if the conclusion is true in every interpretation in which all the premises are true, and otherwise it is invalid. This is exactly the same definition we use for sentential logic, except that we're now qualifying the predicate true with the phrase in an interpretation. Given this definition, it's no surprise that, just like we did in SL, in PL we show that an argument is invalid by providing a counterexample. And the definition of a counterexample in PL shouldn't be surprising either. A counterexample to a PL argument is first and foremost an interpretation. But what kind of interpretation? It's an interpretation in which the argument's premises are true and its conclusion is false. Again, this is exactly the same notion we use when we showed invalidity in SL. The only difference being that now we're talking about interpretations instead of assignments. Let's do an example. Show that this argument is invalid. There is an x such that Sx, therefore Sa. You can see why this argument is invalid. Let's suppose that Sx is the predicate x is snoring. Then the argument is someone is snoring, therefore Al is snoring. If all you know is that someone is snoring, then you can't legitimately infer that it is Al that is snoring. You simply don't have enough information to reach that conclusion. The sentence, someone is snoring, could have been made true by any other member of the domain. So, unless we have additional information in the form of a premise about Al's tendency to snore, or of a stipulation that Al is the only object in the domain, then the inference simply doesn't go through. But let's solidify this intuition with a predicate logic counterexample. Okay, let's look for a counterexample. Let's call our first attempt interpretation H. Interpretation H is an interpretation for the set of sentences comprised of the premise and the conclusion. Let's begin with two names, A and B. If we only use one, that name would have to be A. In this case, A would certainly be the only individual in the domain, and so if someone is snoring, then A is. So this won't work for us. Let's use two objects. In order to interpret there is an x, Sx, we need to evaluate its substitution instances, which in this case are two, Sa and Sb. Which truth values should we give to these sentences? Suppose that we made both of them true. Then at least one of the substitution instances of there is an x, Sx is true. And so the premise, that is, there is an x such that Sx is true. However, since Sa is stipulated to be true, then the conclusion would also be true. So this doesn't work. This isn't a counterexample to the argument. Let's try again. This is interpretation I. Let's now make Sa false in I. Given the truth of Sb, the premise is again true. But now the conclusion is false, so we do have a counterexample now, and the argument is shown invalid. This is equivalent to saying, hey, look, imagine that Beth is snoring, but Al isn't. Then it would be true that someone is snoring without it being also true that Al is the culprit. This scenario seems coherent, so your argument doesn't work. Let's look at this other argument. KAB, therefore every x, KXB. Suppose that KXY is x kisses y. Then the argument would say, Al kissed Beth, therefore everyone kissed Beth. This is obviously invalid, and possibly unfair to Beth, and perhaps even to Al. I'm going to let you do this one, so pause the video and try to find the counterexample, and come back in 5 minutes. Ready? Let's find a counterexample for this argument. Our minimal interpretation will need at least to have the names A and B, since those names appear in the premise. And so, with two names and a dyadic predicate, we have 4 possible atomic sentences. The easiest and most obvious way to begin here is by making the premise true. We do this by assigning the value t to KAB. Easy stuff. Now let's make the conclusion false. Our conclusion is a quantified sentence, and it has these two substitution instances obtained by replacing X with each of the two names in the domain. We need to make at least one of these two sentences false. However, it can't be KAB, since we are already committed to its being true. Therefore, KBB will have to be witness to the conclusion's falsity. So we give it an F. The other two sentences are irrelevant to this argument, so they could be true or they could be false. It doesn't matter. So in this interpretation, the argument's premise is true and its conclusion is false. So it's a counterexample to the argument's validity. Now consider this argument. Can we find a counterexample for it? Suppose we make BB, the premise, true. Can we also make the conclusion false? No. If we make BB true, then there is an XBX will automatically be true. And so there is an XBX or not BB will also be true. This is because the main operator in the conclusion is a disjunction, so if one of the disjuncts is true, the whole sentence is true. So no counterexample is possible for this argument. It must be valid. This was just to keep you on your toes. Now to our last example. Show that this argument is invalid. Notice that the main connective in the premise is the ampersand. Therefore, the premise is a conjunction whose disjuncts are existentially quantified sentences. In the conclusion, however, the operator with the widest scope is the backwards E. So it is an existentially quantified sentence with a conjunction within its scope. So much for the syntax. Let's give a little flesh and bones to this example. Imagine that the predicate bx is x is a barbarian, and lxy is x likes y. Then how would the argument read? I'll give you a minute to think about it. Okay, this is less than a minute, but here it goes. It would be something along these lines. Someone is a barbarian and someone likes Al. Therefore, someone is a barbarian who likes Al. Can you see why this argument is invalid? Think about it. Okay, this interpretation is enough to show that the argument is invalid. And here's why. BB is a substitution instance of there's an XBX, and it's true. Therefore, there is an XBX is true. LAA is a substitution instance of there is an X LXA, and it's true. Therefore, there is an X LXA is true. Since the premise is a conjunction, and both conjuncts are true, the premise itself is true. So we can check it. Now let's deal with the conclusion, which is there is an X such that BX and LXA. Which sentences are substitution instances of this sentence? BA and LAA is one. BB and LBA is the other. BA and LAA is false, and so is BB and LBA. So not all of the substitution instances of there is an X, BX, and LXA are true. In fact, none of them is. Therefore, the conclusion is false. This interpretation is a counterexample. The argument is invalid. Okay, this is all for today. Goodbye.